Hi, so good evening, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you here tonight. My name is Marina Garde, Assistant Director of NYU's KJCC, a center dedicated to Spain and the Spanish-speaking world. On behalf of Jordana Mendelson, Director of the Center, Laura Turregano, Special Projects Officer, and Juan Manuel Avila, Public Humanities Fellow, we welcome you to our center. I'm truly delighted to be here today for the first lecture of our fall semester Andrés Bello Chair, Professor Mario Rufer. The Andrés Bello Chair holds a special place in our center's mission, as it allows us to bring leading contemporary scholars in Latin American culture to NYU for research, teaching, and to support conferences and public lectures, just like this one you are attending today. The Andrés Bello Chair, Latin American Cultures and Civilizations, was officially inaugurated in December 2001 and honors one of the greatest political and intellectual figures of the American hemisphere, the Venezuelan-born humanist, poet, scholar, diplomat, and public intellectual Andrés Bello. Bello's contribution to the Spanish language and the founding of the University of Chile remain enduring legacies. I would like to extend our sincere thanks to Professor Josie Saldaña, who played a key role in nominating Mario Rufer to this prestigious position. Josie?
Hi there. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Mario Rufer, who is a professor of Asian and African Studies at UAM Xochimilco. He is also a graduate from UAM Xochimilco, having received a joint PhD in anthropology and history, in the anthropology and history of Asia and Africa. Mario originally hails from Córdoba, Argentina, however, where he received his undergraduate degree in history from the National University. Professor Rufer is currently the Andrés Bello Chair, but this is only one in a line of visiting professorships recognizing the importance of his scholarship for Latin America. He has been a visiting professor at UCLA, at the Bielefeld Universität in Germany, at the Universidad de Buenos Aires in Argentina, and at the IPE Montevideo in Uruguay, among many other places. Mario is a specialist in post-colonial and cultural studies, and I believe that he, like so many of his generation, came to this specialization honestly. That is, through his deep examination of his own life experience as an intellectual in Latin America. Mario was born during Argentina's short-lived but extremely deadly Dirty War, conducted by the military in plain view between 1974 and 1986. Mario came of age then in post-dictatorship Argentina, a country trying to make sense of its own violent past, and a government trying to figure out how to memorialize that recent past. Mario then spent his late 20s in graduate school in Mexico. Sorry, I'm letting your age out. In graduate school in Mexico at a time when that country was not only transitioning from dictatorship to democracy, from state corporativism to global neoliberalism, but also confronting the history of its own state-sponsored racial oppression of indigenous and Afro-Mestizo people. As a product of his time, Mario has made it his intellectual mission to account for the role of memory and memorialization, not only in the historiography of nations, but in the creation of shared cultural identities through the work of memory, in the aftermath of extreme violence and racism. Professor Rufer's first book, La Nación en Escenas, Memoria Pública y Usos del Pasado en Contextos Postcoloniales, is a study of post-apartheid South Africa and post-dictatorship Argentina, in which he examines how these two nations have used memory and historiography and in the memorialization of public spaces to try to put violent past behind them. Maria Rufer examines how South Africa and Argentina use memory at once to memorialize their violent past, but also to suture over continuing violence and erasure in the post-colonial presence of both countries. La Nación en Escenas looks at jails turned into shopping malls, torture chambers turned into museums, looks at national ceremonies and local parades honoring national history, and at literary texts of both countries along the way to interrogate the political interest behind nation building. However, Mario Rufer draws the reader, I'm sorry, I keep saying Mario, but Professor Rufer draws the reader's attention to the persistence of subaltern memory and memorialization, one that speaks to violences that cannot simply be papered over and are also not quite over. In addition, Mario Rufer has co-edited 8 edited volumes on varied topics on the use of memory and memorialization in nation building, of course, but also on the continued utility of post-colonial studies in our neoliberal present, on methodology in historiography and in ethnography, on media studies, and on other topics. He has published over 30 articles, single author articles in both academic journals and also Latin American magazines and newspapers, writing extensively on Mexico as well, including the silences in the Mexican archives of its own colonial past, as well as in the archives of its revolutionary period. Rufer has, in his academic articles and in his public writing, continued to center indigenous and Afro-Mestizo voices of Latin America past, but also present, because Professor Rufer is in every way the best sort of historian, one from whom the lessons of the past are most essential for the clarification of our shared presence. He is also a very wonderful interlocutor, a very generous colleague, and just generally a very funny and fun person.
Well, thank you, Josie, for this generous introduction. Generous, thoughtful. I am really surprised and touched. And thanks to all for coming tonight. It's wonderful to see friends from different places and different histories here. The title of this lecture is The Altered Archive, Dreams, Ghosts, Murmurs. And the ideas I will present here reflect some of my concerns and my work on the difficulty that history has in dealing with differences and the relationship that this may have with the archive in at least 3 senses: the nature of evidence, the unthought idea of time in history, and the notion of the subject. My work with archives began at a very young age, when I was obsessed with the arrangement of the drawer of my family photos in my grandparents' house. There were photos, yes, but also wedding cards, postcards sent from places my family never knew, and of which they repeatedly spoke, as well as many farewell cards and photo obituaries. I was less obsessed with the object than the arrangement. That drawer could not be desecrated. It was handled with care, and, if I was alone, I could only review it slightly. Much later, when I was studying history, I continued my work with the criminal archives of the Gobernación del Tucumán in Argentina, where I had my first encounters with stories that have stayed with me to this day. Stories of archives buried in borderline zones, borderlines of space, politics, and time. More recently, I worked for 10 years in museums and community archives in Mexico, a country that created these archives as a form of mandate from the multicultural state for the purpose of creation of memories of diversity. These encounters allowed me to forge some questions that I asked through some areas of cultural criticism to question the seemingly transparent relationship between the narrative about the legitimized past, history, and its constant overseer, the archive. More than a place or a repository, archives are also associated with power, ordering, and with a more general notion of reminder. With these ideas that come from these different aforementioned scenes, I will divide this talk into 3 parts: archive and confinement, dream and ghost, to live and to bury. Archive and confinement. In terms of the discourses on its materiality, the relationship between archive and prison or confinement does not seem casual to me. For example, the Archivo General de la Nación in Mexico is housed in what was once one of the largest penitentiaries of this country, The former Robben Island prison in South Africa houses one of the key archives of the apartheid, and visitors are forced to take ID cards with cell numbers to look up files. In Argentina, in turn, the General Archive of the Nation started moving last year to the former Casero Panopticon prison in Parque Patricios after some necessary modifications. What does this relationship between concealment, confinement, enclosure, and archive entail? What myths of sovereignty and threat does the archive awaken and guard? How can we understand the ambiguous relationship between archive and war, archive and bounty, archive and heritage? It is a known fact that almost all official archives represent their content in distance. El Archivo General de la Nación in Mexico, in the main page of its official website, explains that the collection contained in its archives is, and I quote, approximately 375 million sheets of paper, which in length is equivalent to approximately 32.3 miles. The General Archive of the Nation in Argentina boasts that its documents cover 9.3 linear miles from 1778 to 2007. Last week, Professor Jane Anderson in this same venue spoke of the American Indian Record Repository located in Kansas, which has 175 miles of documents, the equivalent distance from New York to Pennsylvania, if I remember correctly. And when I spoke for the only time with the director of the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, South Africa, in 2006, she explained to me, and I quote, if we hadn't lost so much apartheid documentation, we would probably have a length of 100 miles. But we lost a lot. What is this equivalence between papers, distance, and loss? What does it deciphers? Where is the relationship between archive and territory, between archive and jurisdiction, between archive and point of origin? What is the 0 mile of the archive, the kilómetro cero? In 2013, I was working in San Pedro Actopan, a peripheral and semi-rural town of Mexico City, with some groups trying to create a photographic archive of the community. From Mexico City, San Pedro looks like a huge green cordon, and yet it seems like everything there was far away. The group organizing the photo archive, and this is pivotal, were women. Doña Juana, one of the neighbors who was enthusiastic about creating an archive and arranging and curating the photographs, at one point told me the following. Well, from now on, when I make this gesture, it's because I open and close quotations marks, so I not say quote, end of quote. Hey, How long has it been since they took away the concessions from the Gachupines, the Spaniards, and gave us the royal cédulas, the cédulas reales, that we still have in our possession? The king himself gave us the royal cédulas, the cédulas reales. I must say here that, as historians know well, they really still have the royal cédulas of concessions from the 18th century, the peasants, I mean. And now it turns out that they want to give the river concessions to the gringos? No, if they want to take us as fools with this giving and giving and giving. Here, the notion of concession as a figure of colonial roots evidences its structure of conquest. The legal figure of the concession as one of the many axes of republican dispossession, in tune with what Laura Nader and Hugo Matejl call the plundering and illegal character of the rule of law, which has a strictly colonial historical foundation camouflaged in the legal artifices of contractualist fictions, but which is impossible to pursue in the archive, Nader will say, because it is shaped as an origin to make that violence disappear, except in slight gestures, in traces of alteration, but not in statements of affirmation. When I asked Juana why, then, in addition to the museum, they did not create a community archive, a way to compile what interests them, the cédulas reales and photos, what was useful to the community as a memory exercise, at first, she looked at me in astonishment, and probably thought of me as very innocent or very stupid, and then proceeded to say, and I quote, "Look, maestro, if we can't talk about the photograph, it doesn't matter if they kept them. We still won't know what to do with them. It's still with the ruins. What is stored belongs to the government. If we are not able to create a narrative, then there is no point." Juana was clear about something that is evident in any thinking that takes up the ideas of archive and history in post-colonial spaces: the relationship between chronological time, sovereignty, and the dominion over a territory. Dreams and ghosts. Juana herself, on a very hot afternoon, while we were reviewing some possible locations for a show of drawings by local women that had not taken shape yet, told me this. "Yes, they asked us for photos to put the file together here. If we have papers to show that we were present before, papers to show together with the photos." I told them, "No, which photos? What were they going to use to take photos of us? Just the ones from the ID card, la foto infantil, the IFE, equivalence to the security number, social security number here. The IFE photo from before, the one of my grandparents that I always carry with me. They are my treasures. These ones and the cédulas reales. Now other pics. But I bring them in dreams, in my dreams, my grandparents. That's for sure, you know? Oh, I can talk about that. They come in dreams. They are always in the high plains, las tierras altas, and in the green meadows that now belong to the brick-making companies. But who's going to care about what you dream, right, maestro? Who's going to take it seriously? The same thing with the apariciones o fantasmas, that prowl the fields and scare people and who knows what else. The brick-making companies' high shots are always frightened by ghosts. I don't get involved. I'm not saying yes or no. Yo no digo ni que sí, Ni que no. But photographs? No. I have dreams from other times, and you'll find ghosts in any case here. Photos that I don't have. A dream. Juana's dream challenges the strategic logic of writing and, above all, its violence. She has no papers or photos to show that she has lived on these lands for generations, and that she travels in them with her extended kinship between the seasons of the milpa and her own movements required to negotiate with the companies that advance and with the real estate business that it's imposed. But she added, "The only way I am leaving this place is buried with my royal cédulas and my photos. But first, before I leave, I will bury everything." This constant threat of dispossession is a story that repeats itself not only in Mexico but in any post-colonial or neo-colonial space, whose imaginary geography is constituted on the tutelary powers of movable populations, sometimes disposable, sometimes dispensable. "But I bring them in dreams," says Juana, and laughs, affirming the nonsense of the comparison. Dream and archive. And the action of pulling, of bringing. Because she does not say, "I dream of them." "I bring them," she says. "I track them to the present." There is a long anthropological tradition of working on dreams as an alteration to the regular texts of origin and to the homogeneous time. Michael Tausig worked in this way with the Huitoto in Colombia, for example. He showed how dreams and images in dreams bring the scenes of conquest to affirm that dispossession had not stopped happening. But dreams do not constitute an archive. They do not provide evidence. There is no possible diplomacy with them. They are refractory to evidence, to the status of veracity. Couldn't Juana's dreams be thought of as those stories not contained in the linear time of history and its probity? The ghosts that frighten the businessmen of the new brick companies, what do they say about the stories not narrated in the archive? In another encounter in Actopan, Juana said, "Look, maestro, many of the managers, gerentes, left. They can't stand it for long. They see things here. Sometimes I say to myself, is not my grandparents? ¿No serán mis abuelitos?" And she laughs. Maybe. They always made fun of the güeros from the city. Probably you know that the word güero in Mexico is very charged. The truth is that here the empresarios, the businessmen, they cleaned up, fenced in the lands. And now they ask me for photos, proofs. And if by chance we find a piece of paper or a photo of the properties, of the maps of the ejidos, and we take them to the museum, they say, "No, in the museum, the beautiful things, las cosas bonitas." Don't you have any items, alguna pieza arqueológica of the old ones, of the indigenous people? No one understands them, ni quien los entienda. They, them, state agents, museum curators, archivists. Let us remember that the topic of the ghost is present in all national history and is a constitutive part of the writing of history. That which haunts the story, which prevents its domestication and its absolute cancellation. Reinhard Koselleck worked some dreams that were collected, dreams prior to the concentration camps in Germany, as typical sources for history, because the dreams collected in the moments before 1933 strangely foreshadowed the horror of the final solution, while those collected and recorded in concentration camps became unproductive, illegible, opaque to the exit of unconscious. Needless to say that the context I am referring here is completely different. But it interests me because in discussing the complex opposition between res facta and res ficta, fact and fiction if you want, the German author resorted to the dream as a signifying practice that challenged the opposition between poetics and history anchored in the heart of the modern Western discipline. In contrast to his analysis of dreams as a mode of expressing images that otherwise appear ineffable, I am interested in what someone like Juana does with the dream. She connects an experience that has no other way of proving itself, of which she has no evidential hold except in memory. By connecting, she also shows that the problem is not only representation, but legitimacy. Who speaks and how they speak of that which does not create an archive, at least not as we know it. 2 years before that fieldwork, between March and April 2011, I did archival work in the Community Museum of Francisco y Madero in Coahuila, northern Mexico, a town besieged by drought and now by the drug cartels, a town to which, no doubts, I could not travel today. A town where everyone seems to live in a kind of aquatic illusion. The grocery stores are called Abre Laguna, open lagoon. La Lagunita, the little lagoon. And everything around there is totally dry and dusty. In the middle of the explanations about the local archaeological items and the drought of the lagoon region due to 2 companies that drained the water, Corona, the beer, and Lala, the milk, Jose, the town's cultural manager and who had been in charge of the community archive since the previous year, explained to me. In fact, in the heart of the lagoon, which would be here, well, and other parts, they say that there is a presence, a spirit, let's say, that protects the area. And the people around here, the elders, say that until we know who has Pancho Villa's head, his head, the original one, the lagoon will stay dry. Not that I believe in the things. We didn't want to put that in the museum, of course. This is supposed to be a museum of history and of memory. But we do accept the Mexican flags. We don't have Villa's head, but we have his birth certificate, the original one. Later he added, look, Pancho Villa appears in dreams to the people, you know? He appears watering. That's why they say that he is the bringer of water. You know how people are. They like to tell stories. It's important to highlight the posthumous interference conferred to the national popular hero in the course of events of the community. The magical and tragic forces of the state interfere in the course of events, and the power of the popular hero who brings in dreams that which the vicissitudes of neoliberal capitalism subtracted from the agrarian reform. In any case, in the archive, we have the original letter. But between hospitality and between hospitality of the victorious discourse, we could say the history of the archive, state, power, and the ghosts, there is a split. a logic of invitation and the logic of intrusion. Hospitality in the triumphant discourse, in this case the historical and patrimonial discourse of the archive, all that which is enunciated in the file, in the dossier, in the document, somehow maintains the domain of authorship and the decision of who are the owners and who are the guests. But this logic of hospitality, this sensation of dominion of the archive, is always threatened by the ghosts of those who were not invited to history. Where we lost everything, as Juana says, we also lost the leaders like Villa. And something of that which is incomplete haunts the precise account of the imagined community. Or as Juana slips, it is only in the brickworks where they don't recognize the ancestral occupation because there is no archive where ghosts appear. They lurk precisely when the town's archive is being composed. If Koselleck considered dreams pre-linguistic histories and somehow showed how terror was already in them, also Michel de Certeau calls altered languages to the words of the possessed women that dislocated the medical and legal archive. Then, if we speak of the ghost as logic of visitation and stalking to the regular text of proof and facts, I would like to propose here the possibility of treating them as bringing something into experience that has no way of being named in the formal languages of history. We already know that archive and power are inseparable. We also know that what the archive contains is a regime of meaning in itself. We concede Foucault's point. The archive marks the limits of what can be enunciated. Good. But we need archives, more than ever. We need that gesture of narrating and copying and recopying in time, and not out of an obsessive preoccupation with the past and identity. The question I would like to raise here is that taking our archives as principles of interrogation does not so much imply a preoccupation with identity, not what we are, but what we would like to become. Thus, the most powerful epistemic and political action with the post-colonial archive is not, it seems to me, the destituent logic. We all must leave the archives now. No. In any case, let us show the seductive power of synthesis as enunciation that the archive provokes is challenged and interrogated. Not but another archive, a new one, which would be the archive of the subaltern, of the Indian, of the women, of the madman, of the minority, an available counter-discourse, clear, precise, uncolonized, purified. I do not believe it. The archive as an origin of truth is challenged, in any case, with a slight gesture of Juana's laughter when she says, I bring them in dreams, or with the ambiguity that interposes fear. They say there are ghosts. I don't say yes or no. And how we work that relation of montage that Juana or Jose argue? How can we imagine it? In a recent book, Curating Community, Stacey Douglas warns that if history is central as state writing, it is also because there is something curatorial in the definition of time and the archive, a kind of curatorship of sovereignty, where the community is often impeded by the state. But then, the curatorship of sovereignty seems to require a specific relationship with archive and time, a relationship that can be recomposed with specters and irony, with connective memories, and the rarifying of historical syntax, maddening the sequence of time to show the repetition of violence by discussing the continuity of loss and the specters of the archive. Dreams are part of cultural analysis in literature and, of course, in anthropology. In ethnography, the list is long, and there's no point to mention it here. But in fact, in a borderline piece of thought and a beautiful book, Maps and Dreams, Hugh Brody made a prodigious analysis of the role of dreams among the beavers of Canada, almost Arctic hunters. Dreams among them appear as a kind of rare reading they make of the hunting territory, a specific training that links the sources of the hunt with the act of anticipated reading of a text, a map and its roots. Without that dream, hunting is impossible in that village, and surviving as well. But once again, what about history? Let us remember Lichtenberg's well-known phrase. It is a sadness. All human history is only the history of awakened men. I wanted to bring this last allegory of dreaming and hunting into a discussion on history and the archive precisely because I think the allusion to the practice of hunting, cazar, is not minor if we remember the famous text by Carlo Ginzburg, Roots of an Evidential Paradigm, from 1990. In it, as you probably know or remember, Ginzburg tried to return history to a conjectural, symptomatic, and indexical thinking, not inductive or experimental. The famous phrase of that text is this: the historian is a hunter. He follows in the footsteps of his prey. Professor Ginzburg assumed that the knowledge generated by history does not apply to the conditions of experimentation, replicability, and generalization of science. According to Ginzburg, historical knowledge, like that of the physician, is hinting, indirect, and conjectural. The evidence, los indicios, the traces, las huellas, are the key to all knowledge about the past, according to the Italian thinker. And the meaning of those traces is only possible by narrating, by telling stories. Well, there has already been a subtle challenge to Ginzburg's thesis, or at least a warning from the borderline zone of history, sovereignty, and the archive. I would like to recall now the epistolary discussion between historian Adolfo Gili and the subcomandante Marcos of the EZLN, the Mexican Zapatista Army of National Liberation, on Ginzburg text in the midst of 90s, compiled in the book Discusión sobre la Historia. In 1994, in the midst of the effervescence provoked by the Zapatista uprising, Gili sent Marcos, through friends who went up to the Selva Lacandona, a copy of Ginzburg text with a letter in which he recommended its reading to Marcos. For all that Ginzburg warns about traces, about what modern states puts in secrecy in the official archive, and about the need for a restitutive imagination for another history. The subcomandante soon replied in an impassioned letter. He replied that the text was very good, that it was convincing and remarkable, that it had been difficult to read, but that in the end he understood it, that it has many quotations, and is very erudite, that he enjoyed it, but that the text of the Italian gentleman had a central problem. It does not think about the hunter. Marcos does not say more, but we can make sense of it. The hunter, the historian, is not a universal subject. He is traversed by positions of race, gender, class, ethnicity, which condition the readings of traces. We could add an edge to this warning. Not only do they condition the reading of the signs, but they also leave the question open for what trace is the one summoned by the historian's intuition. What mark? What signs? The question thus posed, needless to say, is a question about the archive. To leave, to bury. I must confess that I have not been back to San Pedro Actopan for a long time, probably because I cannot. On the last trip, 4 years ago, I learned that Juana and her family had abandoned the place. The brick companies? I asked in an unseemly shout to Amalia, her lifelong neighbor. Amalia made the gesture of denial with her head, looked to the four sides, and at the same time, in a low voice, she said to me, "The narco." They left them a piece of paper on the door of the lot with a phone number. That they had something for them. They gave them 2,000 pesos for the land, like $120. But they could no longer enter the highlands. They were afraid. They left. We don't know where they went. The narco, they were told, that shapeless guest that had only been narrated from the opaque face of the monster, a figure that, as before the ghost, conjures up the voice and cannot be looked at head-on. In our plundered worlds, the outdoors take the form of an abysmal totality without image. Crime, the narco, la migra. I'm aware that Amalia knows where Juana is, and I also know that she could not tell me. She was protecting her. Interestingly, in the state's digitally available files, her INE, her clave única de registro de población, her registro federal de contribuyentes, remain unchanged. For that bureaucratic consignment, Juana continues to live in a place that no longer exists. Sometimes I wonder if Juana took with her the file of cédulas reales that she treasured, together with the photos. I also wonder what role an archive plays in the midst of this possession. I even wonder if she has buried them, as they threatened to do, and if so, where they are. In Actopan, I understood a sentence that I've read many years ago by the South African historian Peter Heimelklerk. Our laws are too fragile and our bodies too flimsy to support the transparency of history. Of what use was the transparency of history, her cédulas reales, her fragmentary dreams, to Juana now? What about this borderline action of burying? It is just a funerary ritual, the proposal of waiting for a better future to exhume? I remember the archivist of the Community Museum of Soquite, a small town in Zacatecas, a town almost devoid of men and young people due to the effects of migration. He told me they dug up the tooth of a mammoth and then they covered everything up. Those of the government, those of the INA. INA is the National Institute of Anthropology and History. There were papers, deeds. It is said that many things were there, but they covered everything up. I think it's better, Maestro. Who knows what they will find if they continue digging? Again, the rumor of a treasure. Secret and danger. At this point, I would like to remember two stories that had prompted me to think many years ago about the hidden and buried archives. The first is a tragic because it marks the origin of the national history of my country, Argentina. There, at the end of the 19th century, in the area of Salinas Grandes, where Patagonia begins, the Mapuche cacique Namuncurá buried the archive of his father, Calfucurá, which contained the written evidence of treaties between the incipient national government and the indigenous domains. In 1878, Namuncura's men dug a huge pit on the border of the land between the Chiloé dunes and the lagoon and buried the archive in large wooden boxes covered with tanned leather, when it was already evident to them that the flight south toward the Rio Negro was the only momentary salvation in the face of the breach of peace, the military advance, and the decision taken by what Julio Argentino Roca called ultima ratio regum, the purchase of 20,000 Remington rifles, with the approval of the Senate to exterminate the native population. The history of the archives buried in border scenes is also profuse from the scenes of the conquest of America, as many historians, as Jimena Rodriguez, have shown. The second story that I would like to tell is closer in many senses. The story of an old son of Italian immigrants at the end of the 20th century, impoverished by the enclosure policies of the monoculture farms in Argentina, who became landless and jobless and lived clinging to a shoebox containing 2 photos of his childhood and a letter from Eva Duarte de Perón written in 1947 offering him a job in the post office of a Pampa town. He kept that box on the last shelf of the closet, and every then and now he would take it down, reread it, and something would light up. A hope, a promise perhaps. That old man fought 22 years for a decent pension in a federal trial that was never resolved. One Sunday, on the eve of the barbecue, the old man burned the 450 pages of the trial he was filing. In the 90s, when the only corner of the nation he had left was the backyard of his house, in that town devastated by agrochemicals, and a few weeks before he died, he made a trench in that yard. One summer afternoon, and without anyone seeing him, he buried his shoebox, carefully taped with Evita's letter and the 2 photos of his childhood. That old man's name was Alfredo Damiano, and I am his only grandson. Buried archives, anachronistic dreams, treasured documents. What is this peculiar obsession that seems to stitch writing with dispossession, disappearance with oblivion, impeded archive with disturbed dreams? Whoever writes is silent. Quien escribe, calla, says Maria Negroni in her book El Corazón del Daño. What is history, if not that ever inconsistent question about what its writing silences? Coda. Will Juana de Actopan continue to dream of her living grandparents in the highlands of the Valley of Mexico? Will Pancho Villa continue to bring water in the dreams of the inhabitants of the raised lands in the Comarca Lagunera? What affirms the tenacity of a dream that history is incapable of illuminating? In 1880, Estanislao Ceballos, the Argentine jurist and essayist and plunderer and body snatcher, found Calfucurás' archive among the dunes on his trip to Patagonia and kept it obsessively, like someone driven mad, until his death. Nobody has had access to it until much later, and historian Claudia Sesti says that Ceballos wrote obsessively that the archive was cursed. As for me, I searched for my grandfather's shoebox only once, in the midst of my mother's furious cries. "You are crazy," Stop rummaging. You're crazy. Stop rummaging. Digging up a treasure, as all children's literature attests, is a double-edged sword. It restores something, but it also triggers an uncontrollable fire. Something denied to time makes an indelible appearance. If, as Miguel Dalmaroni says, the task of the archive is not to replace or to restitute the fact, but to set the present to inconsistency, I like that phrase, perhaps it would be wise to begin to think of history as the writing of those inconsistencies, the abandonment of the sovereign pretension of the text that can yield to the uncertainty of the present. Philosopher George Agamben says that history is that where mystery has extinguished or hidden its fires. To ask later, and can we be satisfied today by a narrative that lost all relationship with fire? Perhaps this restitution of mystery, of fire, of affection, is the central political vocation for rethinking the relationship between archive, history, memory, and present. In these times of ours, where dispossession, looting, denial of irrefutable facts, and perplexity are far more commonplace than proof, documents, truth, and justice. Thank you.
First of all, I love this lecture that you've given. It's so evocative of the complexities with the materiality of the archive. And I was just wondering that so much of the accounts are through your conversations, through kind of communication, grounded in objects, but also in kind of evocations and shared stories. And I was wondering about, as you worked with these archives, have you noticed in your conversations with people a kind of qualitative difference in their relationship to objects when to archives when the objects change? Like, I think about, official archives and administrative documentation, family archives and photographs, sound archives and decaying audio tapes. And I'm wondering about the stories that you were collecting and the responses to it. How or do those stories change dependent upon the objects themselves, or are they kind of consistent ways of thinking through the physicality of the archive regardless of the specificity of the object? I'm not sure if that makes sense, but it was something I was kept thinking about in terms of the variety of objects that archives hold.
Thank you, Jordana. Well, I think that probably the most amazing thing for me, it was realizing that when they were telling me the stories, they were creating an archive, and they were like, they were assuming that they were creating an archive. I recorded many tapes and with interviews, with pictures of the talleres, the workshops, of memory workshops, and there they could we could say, well, archive has many forms, many shapes, many kinds of materials, of nuances, and also of utilities, of uses, of possible uses, And I think that in many senses, when, for example, that show with drawings made by women in San Pedro Actopan was really an important thing about on how do they start to think about their heritage, for example, not only the the indigenous glorious past, but also, for example, the disappeared people. They struggled. We struggled to make their narratives legitimate in order to be shown in the museum, because they didn't agree with that, saying that this is a museum for heritage and memory. the confusion between memory and heritage is it has a political value there. It's a political kind of restitution, I think. And we are trying to say, well, this is memory in terms of an occasion, a form to show a kind of desacuerdo, to disagreement in terms of what are we living here, in terms of the present. How is our present, stitched to the past? Because otherwise they are always like compulsed to narrate a history related to that one of the museums of archaeology and anthropology, and they, for them it's difficult to find another language to do different things. And I think that was a lesson for me also, there.
Hi, Mario. Thank you. That was wonderful. You quoted Michel de Certeau, and it was also making me think of his distinction at a basic level of space and place. But there seemed to be something quite subversive in the lecture, in the sense that if sometimes you have placeless spaces in physical geography described without much reference to the population, and then you have places with a lot of description in human geography with a lot of reference to the population, that here the documents are actually underneath the ground and are actually subverting our idea of how we organize different places. I mean, I picked it up a bit in the section about the Canadian hunters as well. So I was wondering if it's made you think differently, about the archive and geography, and how how the archive is now residing more in displaced and dispossessed people, rather than the conventional ideas you brought out at the beginning about the prison and so on.
Thank you. Well, I think it's a wonderful question. When they, for example, there's something, I don't know how to say it, there's something tragic in some sense when the communities are trying to represent their lived geographies in space. It's very difficult for them to do that without without the tools of the state, in terms of what James Scott said about seeing like a state, like the organization of a place from a single point of view, and I think that probably what we can do with probably what we have here is a kind of claiming about the organization, the symbolic organization of place and space through the different languages they are claiming here in terms of of forming an archive. Dreams, specters go saying we are, when they recorren, when they are in the highlands, for example, the peasants, they move with the seasons, for example. They create a kind of relational geography. It's very different from a kind of map, districts, administrative things, and then claiming this different sort of archives needs a new language. And I think that probably it's a good question to think further in terms of the relationship between archive, geography, place, space, and the imaginative constitution of community, for example. I think it's a good point, because, and sometimes, as Robert Crabb has an excellent book called Cartographic Mexico. It's a kind of history of the imagination of Mexico as a territory, as a place. It's a very good book. And what he says many times in the book is geography is also a kind of language stolen by populations. Stolen to the populations, a kind of language impossible to access for the populations. And it's a kind of codification. And what are we dealing with here? I think that yours is a good point to imagine.
Thank you.
New researches, new investigations.
Thank you, Mario, for your wonderful lecture. I found it deeply poetic, and I appreciate that because I'm not very used to academic lectures with this poetic and this rhythm, and I really appreciate it. The question that I have is about who do you think is the subject of responsibility for this archives that, for me, were all archives like subalternos, subaltern archives, not only of marginalized people. I mean, the examples that you gave us, like the experiences that you shared with us today, were all from, as I understood, from marginalized people, but also like the forms that the archive you are referring to, like ghosts, dreams, murmurs, disappear people, are all archives that have been left out of the margin or in the margin. And I was wondering if you, I mean, what, who would be the responsible subject to put these archives in the center, epistemologically, ethically, politically, but also you just said that these archives or need a new language or a different language. I was wondering if it might not, maybe it's not a new language because they speak a language. There is a language, but maybe what it's needed here is a new listening, not language, but listening.
Listening.
And the other is just a comment, because your the first line of the poster reminded me of how the buscadoras right now in Mexico are calling treasures what they're looking for, and the hidden treasures. I was thinking that, well, now we have a kind of new, and I'm going to copy your quotation marks. We have a new archive in Mexico, in el territorio mexicano, that speaks, but we don't listen.
Yes. I was avoiding go there because it's a very difficult problem. No. But I agree with you, and I really appreciate your point, because I think they are calling treasures also, and well, they are dealing with a very problematic assumption about treasures versus justice, sometimes. And about your first question, I thank you, because I think it's in some sentence I say there's not only a problem of representation, it's a problem of legitimacy, and I think that's the point in terms of regimes of legitimacy. And my I don't know how to say, my claim, my fight, my struggle is with history as a discipline, with historians, with what are we, in terms of for example, in the last book by Joan Scott, in on the judgment of history, I think that she puts the things clear in terms of what is our social and political utility today, in terms of if facts are being legitimate by states and trials and lawyers, what's the point with history? And I think that probably we must understand that looking to these narratives more imaginatively, also in our places, I am not that we have to say, I know that here we have a huge problem, I am also avoiding is the problem of the truth, historical truth, of course. But I think that history needs to do something about that, in terms of, that's my point. Who is the subject? Well,
Thank you so much for that. I don't know if it's a question so much as a thought. What I found really moving, really poignant is that in both of those oral histories that you're gathering, they're actually appealing to the state, to the revolutionary state, really profoundly. The cédula Pancho Villa's had, and it's almost like, there's an old-fashioned battle between the ejido and the brick company, and then the narcos like erase, that's make that kind of irrelevant, right, for history. And anyway, I'm intrigued by the desire, be it, desire to be archived, right, in your subjects. And if you can speak a little bit in terms of what you think that desire is about, even with their dreams and their, you know what I mean? Like they're actually entering those dreams into the record because you're recording, you know what I mean? Even though they say at the same time they have no weight, they believe it to have weight, you know what I mean? Like what does it say about their own hope in the archive?
well, I will say two things. First, thank you, because that question is all when you listen to the people, when you listen to Juana, Jorge, Jose, their narratives are always mediated by the state language. They are the state in terms of the revolution. They are speaking that language, of course. And I was always surprised because the form of an archive, the idea of archive produces desire and produces hope. They are always like trying to, the question here is, what are the main records, the main facts, the main things that they want in the archive? For example, but there is a part that I couldn't show here, but Juana said in some sense, in some point of the creation of the community archive, she said to me, I don't want to put photos or pictures with a little cédula, a little label, trying to say the year, blah blah blah. If we won't tell stories, the main thing is how can we tell stories, not to classify, to tax, to put a number, to put a in this sense. It always reminds me Funes el Memorioso, the Borges short story about that man who remembers everything, who has many datos, many numbers, but he can't think, he can't generalize, he can't conceptualize. Her claim was, we need something else than have things here. We need to conceptualize what we are living here in those periods where we have the state here, the brick companies, and the narcos in a kind of asedio constante. Right? And I think that is a claim that always is like grounding me, Well, thank you for the question.
Thank you so much for that great talk. I have a question about the poster and the design and the color pink. I was wondering, so the pink of the color got me thinking about sort of resonances of different sensory cues and the ways that pink has been coded as a sort of queer color, sort of resonance with the past. And I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on sort of the queerness of dreams, ghosts, and murmurs in relation to this project, as well as in relation to your methods.
Thank you, Seb. Well, the picture actually was taken by my partner some years ago, and I've chosen that because I've thought that probably this picture conjures up a kind of invitation to, using your own expression, to queer the archive. It's like it's a kind of composition in this sense, and I do think that thinking about the queering the archive and queering history, I think it has much to do with not only with what is there, but how we tell, once again, how we tell stories, how we pronounce them, how we compose them, how we can include not only the voices, but also the resonances, and what are we listening to when we are like dealing with human materiality, in terms of the traces of Lucien Febvre, when he said in the Annales school in the 40s, he said, we must do something in terms of not putting things in order, but to ask for what disorder we want to ask for history, or to write history. Then I think that, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think that in this sense, I would like to think about queering archives and histories, and that's why the design, I liked so much the design when they saw this, because it was exactly what I was trying to do with the picture, trying to and to mark exactly the pink wooden parts of the chairs.
Thank you so much. We
Thank you so
can
much. Thank you.
go to the lobby and enjoy the reception. Thank you.